Monsters have always stalked the night. Since the world began, tales of terrible beasts in the dark have been told around the fires holding the shadows at bay. All these tales have the same message. We are not alone. From the trolls of Europe to the Bigfoot of California, the swamp ape of Florida to the yowie of Australia, all are Sasquatch. This is their story. A distant scream echoed through the starlit forest. The young Sasquatch immediately froze in his tracks and looked up at the broad back of the alpha male in front of him. Already tall for his age, the juvenile's eyes were almost level with his mother's, but his father's wide shoulders still towered above him, his enormous bulk a reassuring wall of muscle and straggly hair. He too had stopped to listen to the scream as its echoes faded away into the forest-covered mountainside. The youth intently watched his father's expression for guidance as the giant alpha male slowly turned his huge hairy body to look back down the trail over the juvenile's head. The light of the three-quarter moon glinted in the depths of his piercing eyes, almost hidden in the deep shadow of his heavy brow. He stood perfectly still, watching and listening. His nostrils flared, trying to catch any hints of the scream's source that may be wafting on the light mountain breeze. Behind the youngster, his mother had also stopped in her tracks at the throat-ripping terror expressed in the scream. She too was intently staring at her mate, eyes wide and alert. Absolute silence replaced its dying echoes. The entire forest had frozen, waiting. The silence stretched out, and the scream was not repeated. A few paces away, a cricket unfroze itself and began to chirp. With a deep huff of dismissal, his father turned back to the path and continued on his way. But he had barely taken 2 steps when the scream sounded again, this time followed by a tremendous crash that like thunder echoed and rolled through the tree-filled canyons. Immediately the family froze again, all three turning to look back down the valley towards the source of the noise. Just as the echoes died off, there was another thunderous crash, followed by more screams, which were quickly drowned out by a deep-throated roar. It was a roar so loud it almost drowned out the thunderclaps that were now going off one after the other. Crash, crash, crash. At the sound of the roar, his father's expression instantly changed from concern to anger. The giant male lowered his head even further into his broad, hairy shoulders, and a low growl rumbled from deep within his massive chest. The juvenile's eyes widened. He had never heard such a growl. It frightened him, and he started to rock from one foot to the other with anxiety. Then he caught the faint yet pungent aroma issuing from his father's scent glands, and the anxiety intensified even more. The big alpha was obviously enraged by something, but the scents wafting from his father's arms told the young Sasquatch there was fear mixed with his father's rage. His legs rocked faster, loading his muscles with oxygen ready to bolt. He had seen his father face down fully grown grizzly bears and send them packing. What could he possibly be afraid of? The huge alpha male Sasquatch flexed his shoulders and cracked his neck as if preparing to fight, but he did not otherwise move. He stood as still as an immense granite boulder, listening intently to the night as the roar faded and died. No more crashes of thunder sounded. The entire forest stayed silent, waiting. Then it came. One last desperate throat-tearing scream from something in great fear and pain, and the night was quiet once more. It seemed to the young Sasquatch that even the breeze had stopped its low sigh through the pine needles to listen to the sounds of terror and violence that had filled the high forested valleys. His father looked down over his head towards his mother, an even heavier than usual scowl etched deep into his strong brow. The young Sasquatch turned to look past his mother in the direction from whence the sounds had torn apart the night. He looked at his mother and noticed she was baring her teeth in rage. There was a strange rumbling that seemed to come from the ground beneath his feet, but then he realized it was not coming from the earth, it was coming from his mother. The rumbling grew in pitch and issued forth from her gritted teeth as a sound that he now heard for only the second time in his life. The first time he heard that sound was only 2 nights ago. After an unsuccessful hunt, the family had returned to the tree that his mother had hidden his baby sister in. But the newborn had been missing from its fork high up above a grizzly's reach. His mother had gone frantic, tearing at the nearby brush, trying to find her baby. His father had stopped, stared at the tree for a moment, then had bent to study the ground, intently searching for sign. He had then sniffed at some deep scratches on the tree before commanding his mate to stop searching and pointed at the ground. Tears pouring from her eyes, she had come over to see what he was looking at. When his mother saw the strange tracks at the foot of the tree, she had looked up at her mate, but he had refused to meet her eyes. Instead, he simply stood still, staring down at the tracks. Only a slight quivering of his immense shoulder muscles gave any indication of his swiftly rising anger. It was then the young Sasquatch had heard that sound for the first time as a question from his mother's lips. The giant alpha male had growled back a reply, and in a sudden fury had turned and pounded off into the forest, striking out with his massive hairy arms at the trees as he went, leaving a wide path of destruction in his wake. The youngster knew his father well enough to stay out of his way when he was angry, so instead of following him, he stayed behind with his distraught mother. For ages she had simply sat slumped on the ground, staring at the tree and the long deep claw marks in its trunk. Huge sobs racked her giant hairy frame as she mourned her baby daughter, oblivious to all around her. Seemingly endless tears rolled down her hairy cheeks and fell from her wide jaw, each drop throwing up tiny clouds of dust as they hit the dry earth. Through his own tears, the young Sasquatch had noticed the night sky getting brighter with the coming day, so he had touched his mother's shoulder gently, making her jump. Her eyes were vacant, not really seeing him. With a question, he had then repeated the sound she had growled to his sire. Immediately her eyes focused on him, making him involuntarily take a step back from the sudden rage contained within. The tears were gone. One lip lifted, her strong white teeth catching the growing light of the morning to come. With one angry sweep of her hand, she had brushed away the strange tracks and gotten to her feet. But her hand did not completely erase what appeared to be deep gouges in the earth from claws. The young Sasquatch had looked again up at the tree, and above his head he had seen those same gouges carved into the hard wood like it was clay. They reminded him of a grizzly's claws, but larger and unbelievably sharp. The snarl still on her face, his mother had followed the wide trail her mate's anger had made into the forest. They had been walking ever since, as if in an effort to get away from the area before full daybreak. But then his reduced troop had not stopped even when the sun rose high above the mountains. The harsh brightness of day had hurt his eyes. Sasquatch were creatures of the dark night, not the bright burning light of day. On and on they walked, crossing many ridges rather than meandering up creek beds as was the norm. Along the ridge tops the sun was unbearable to his eyes, but on he had walked, following his mother. From time to time he had glimpsed his father keeping pace with them, just out of sight, protecting them from whatever a mushkar was. Finally, in the lowering afternoon sun, they had come down yet another ridge line to a flowing creek. His father had been standing there waiting for them. Finally, the young Sasquatch was allowed some rest and a long drink that was nectar to his parched throat. But all too soon night had fallen, and he had been gently shaken awake to keep on moving. They had not been walking long when that awful first scream had shattered the night. It was not that desperate dying scream, but the roar that had made his mother now growl that sound for the second time with scary ferocity he had never heard from her before. The youngster felt the hair on his neck and shoulders stand up. In the darkness he saw the moonlight reflecting blood red in his mother's eyes. He looked at his father, who answered her with a curl of his upper lip exposing his strong teeth. She spat the sound again. and with her eyes burning in rage, she turned and began running back down the path in the direction the sounds had come from. His father commanded her to stop, but she ignored it and instead began running faster, away from her family towards whatever had made that horrendous howl. The young Sasquatch could feel her heavy footfalls shaking the ground as she ran. Immediately the alpha took off after her, leaving the youngster no choice but to follow. He had to drop to all fours to catch up to his parents, and when he did, he was surprised to see his father had not stopped his mother. Instead, he had overtaken her and was crashing through the forest ahead, clearing a path through the denser brush with his massive arms as he ran. Soon they crossed into the next valley, and his father slowed down and started moving quietly, his form blending into the shadows and darting from tree to tree, making it hard even for the young Sasquatch's natural night vision to follow. The summer had been long and hot, and he found it difficult to tread quietly on the parched, dry leaves. So as he moved, he studied the ground carefully with his night eyes for patches of bare earth, stones or tree roots to step on. His father made it look easy as his shadow danced ahead, leading him on to whatever a mushka was. Occasionally he still caught hints of the fierce scent from his father in the night air, which worried him greatly. He had seen his giant sire stand down a charging grizzly and steal deer from hairless hunters armed with deadly weapons that killed from a great distance. The young Sasquatch was not sure if he wanted to find out what a mushka was, if his father feared it so. He and his mother eventually caught up to the giant alpha standing still and quiet just inside the tree line of a small clearing. Off to one side trickled a slow-running creek. The peaceful sounds of the water bubbling through the rocks was in stark contrast to the scene that lay before them. It was a camp made by the Hairless Ones. In the centre of the small clearing was a large fire, its flames only just beginning to die down. The strange brightly coloured skin that they always erected to sleep under was torn to shreds, with one of its poles pointing up to the sky like the broken rib bone of a deer. Strewn everywhere was the detritus of the belongings they always carried with them, containers crushed and ripped apart, cans and clothing thrown about in the dirt. Next to the fire was one of the Hairless Ones itself. A bloodied head was lying a few feet away from its body, the eyes frozen in fear, the mouth open in a permanent, soundless scream. One hand still held the long black metal weapon they hunted with, the source of those loud, thunderous crashes earlier. Closer to the torn-up shelter was another Hairless One, a female, likewise twisted in death. Its head was also lying a few feet away, half hidden under a broken camp chair. The smell of fresh blood was everywhere, filling the night. The young male stood silent a few steps to the left of his mother and stared, eyes wide, trying to comprehend what had happened here. Then a movement drew his eyes to the other side of the torn-up shelter. Two huge black shadows were crouched in the near darkness beyond the dying firelight. One of the forms poked at something on the ground, which let out a squeal like a baby pig. The sound of the squeal broke the trance. His mother roared. A ripping sound that shook the brush and tore at the trees all around with built-up anger, frustration and sorrow. The two creatures jumped to their feet and the young Sasquatch saw them clearly for the first time. Nearly as tall as his father but not quite as muscular, their ribs stood out from hunger. Their hair was patchy as if suffering from some skin affliction. Their faces protruded into long muzzles like huge wolves. Their ears were high on their heads as well, with ragged tufts of hair jutting out from within them, making them appear even more menacing. Their long, heavily muscled arms extended almost to their knees, the long claws that tipped their bony fingers adding considerably to the length. Dark droplets of blood ran down the hair on their forearms and off the sharp claws that drip onto the dirt. The creatures instantly caught sight of his mother, and their lips pulled back from their teeth, showing long, vicious-looking canines. With a menacing growl they started advancing, making the young Sasquatch involuntarily flinch with fear and dread. The movement made them hesitate, and noticing him for the first time they switched their evil red eyes to him. He could clearly see the tops of their muzzles wrinkling as they tasted the air, smelling him as well as seeing him. They filled their lungs, growing larger and even more threatening as a result, and both creatures roared a challenge, exposing those sharp, terrifying teeth once more. Then they restarted their advance, one changing direction towards him while the other continued towards his mother. As they approached, they lifted their massive arms to attack, clawed fingers twitching, the blood of the Hairless Ones glinting in the firelight. The young Sasquatch glanced at his mother, expecting her to run, but she stood her ground, brow furrowed in rage, a deep, barely audible growl emanating from deep within her chest. Instead of running, she raised her own arms and hunched her back, clenching her fists and bending her knees, ready to do battle. Following her lead, he did the same, even though these creatures were taller, heavier, and equipped with terrifying weapons of both tooth and claw. He knew they had no chance against these monsters, yet the young Sasquatch refused to flee and abandon his mother. Instead, he crouched lower in his fighting stance as one of the creatures advanced towards him, stepping around the fire, the dying light reflecting in the burning coals of its eyes. Suddenly, a large rock came flying out of the darkness of the trees to crash against the creature's head. Staggering, it fell sideways into the fire, holding its cracked skull and screaming in rage and pain. At first, it writhed on its back, ignorant of the flames, both hands trying to squeeze away the pain in its head. But then the hair on its back caught alight. The stench of burning hair raked at his nostrils as the young Sasquatch watched the monster scramble out of the fire and charge off on all fours, screaming into the darkness of the forest. The momentum of its panicked flight added air to the flames, which quickly flared into bright torches that disappeared into the trees. The remaining creature crouched defensively. Confused, it flickered its evil red eyes back and forth into the brush from whence the rock had come, its lips twitching in a nervous, growling snarl. Out of the dark shadows advanced his father. The giant alpha male's arms held away from his body, making his enormous frame appear even larger. Although not as heavily built, the wolf-like monster matched him in height. For a moment, the two stood facing each other, the creature cowering in confusion, its head swiveled, trying to see if any more foes were going to emerge from the dark forest. The unmistakable stench of fear burned into the young Sasquatch's nostrils, while the beast's top lip nervously flipped and curled, exposing its deadly teeth as it weighed its options, fight or flight. Then his father arched his shoulders, filled his giant lungs, and roared. It was a roar of power and ancient rage the young Sasquatch had never heard before. The trees shook from the force of it, the incredible volume filling the world. The very bones of the mountains seemed to tremble at its power, as the ghosts of 1,000 generations of Sasquatch echoed their rage through the centuries. Feeling the roar vibrating deep within his bones, the young Sasquatch felt his own knees involuntarily weaken with its almost supernatural force. The creature obviously felt it too, for it suddenly urinated in terror. Its knees visibly shook and the blood drained from its wolf-like face. It glanced around as if seeing the scene for the first time. Then, with a terrified yelp like a coyote, it dropped onto all fours and bolted into the trees, crashing frantically through them as it fled. The crashing sounds had already begun to fade when the young Sasquatch realised his mother was no longer standing near. A strange, high-pitched wailing was coming from where the two creatures had been crouching, and his mother was now standing in their place, staring down at something on the ground. She squatted down to pick it up, and standing back upright held something small and pale to her chest. The wailing sounds immediately stopped, and with a shock he realised he was hearing the sound of suckling. He followed his father across to where his mother was standing. Both their eyes widened as they watched her holding the thing to her breast, suckling it exactly like he had seen his own baby sister feed until recently. The ghostly pale thing had a face much like his sister's, but softer, smaller, with tiny eyes and a rounder, hairless skull. The skin was almost translucent, pale and delicate like that of a petal on a flower. Above its eyes a deep, angry scratch glistened with red beating blood. His mother licked at it, cleaning the wound of any dirt left by the monster's claw. His father reached out a curious finger and prodded at the thing, making it drop the teeth and start wailing again. His mother uttered an angry sound at his father and popped the teeth back into its mouth, immediately quieting it and comforting it once more. With a shrug, the big alpha turned and walked off into the forest. His mother turned and followed, still suckling the hairless little baby, her long hairy arms wrapped around it protectively. With one last long look at the torn-up camp and the headless bodies scattered about in crimson pools of sticky blood, the young male turned and followed his parents back into the dark safety of the forest.